Hi, this is 3MD coming to you with the last month in review, April 2020. The silent spring of 2020 truly showed the limits of our industrial civilization. This time around, there were no jokes flying on April Fool's Day, as measures to slow down the spread of the virus were creating disruptions in the food sector. Russia was limiting wheat sales overseas, and Vietnam was stockpiling rice. France's agriculture minister was encouraging unemployed people to go work on farms. The coronavirus had ushered in a war economy unprecedented since the Second World War. Massive government interventions were needed to protect the channels of economic circulation. Western nations were restricting their exports of medical supplies to developing countries. COVID 19 was forcing the West to re-evaluate its social structure and healthcare provision. The era of peak globalization was over, and it was being replaced by a more fragmented world. We were faced with the task of building a more sustainable and habitable world. In China, the virus had provided a rationale for expanding the surveillance state and even stronger political control, while European solidarity seemed little more than a fairy tale. The EU could not discharge the protective functions of a state. It might have been inspired by the Roman Empire, but in reality, it seemed more similar to the Holy Roman Empire. Russia, who seemed to have won the oil standoff against Saudi Arabia, was set to increase its influence over a balkanized Europe. The world economy was baffled by the new reality of coronomics. For the first time, economists could not gaze into their crystal ball and give out projections. We were all flying blind. The developed world was trying to cope with mass unemployment levels unseen since the Great Depression. Whilst everyone was blaming the virus, some were pointing to the fact that shortfalls in revenue and cash flows caused by the shutdowns were in fact simply exposing the vulnerabilities of a structurally unsound economic and financial system. Sino-American tensions were escalating to a worrying degree, as some were accusing Beijing of having falsified infection and death rates. After all, China was poised to Sinoform the world, especially through its use of digital healthcare, perhaps the single biggest economic trend of the 21st century. While America was obviously unprepared for this major crisis, just as it had been during the last two in 2008 and 2001. The planet was on lockdown, but was mass quarantine really the way to go? Perhaps the crisis was being used as an excuse to increase the biopower of states over individuals, who would become ever increasingly monitored full time via the real possibility of microchips forcibly inserted into their bodies. The 93-year-old Queen Elizabeth II tried to steady her kingdom through a rare public address, as the Prime Minister Johnson was still hospitalized due to his infection with the coronavirus. Measures were being taken to protect public health at the expense of economic growth and political liberty. Italy, the epicenter of the pandemic in Europe, was in complete lockdown for a month, and the economic toll on the country had been enormous. The country had led the way in showing the rest of the West that you could impose severe restrictions on people's lives and the economy in a democratic country. COVID 19 was presenting countries with stark choices between life, death, and the economy. As many worshippers were obliged to suspend their rites, hitherto regarded as vital, the pandemic was exposing fissures within all religions. The Easter of 2020 was like none other that preceded it. St. Peter's Square was deserted, and the Pope officiated the ceremony on a digital platform. Whilst some evangelicals in the US, the ultra Orthodox in Israel, and the group of Shia fanatics in Iraq continued to congregate despite the dangers of transmission. Speculations were being voiced about the potential of the crisis to bring about a new digital financial system. Perhaps states would implement a system of mandatory vaccination post-crisis that would adorn each individual with a nanochip that would be used as a digital identity card, both for tracking and financial transactions. Rumors set aside, one thing seemed to be clear. America was failing its basic moral responsibility to safeguard the health and welfare of its citizens. While American billionaires were posting pictures of their self-isolation on their super yachts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, columnists were warning that the pandemic would lead to a social revolution led by the jobless and hungry masses of the world. COVID-19 was deconstructing the myth of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism on both sides of the Atlantic. The crisis that plagued especially the United States had its roots on an over-reliance on China as the factory of the world, specifically in regards to medical equipment and active pharmaceutical ingredients. At a time when both countries were blaming the other for having manufactured the virus, it seemed like a more heated Cold War would follow the pandemic, the theater of which might play out in Southeast Asia. One thing seemed clear: Western nations would re-evaluate their defense strategies to incorporate healthcare. But the time had arrived for people to realize that we were dealing with the planetary demons that could not be exorcised by one or the other nation state. We had to realize that the only solution was a global conscious effort. As more and more people started to talk about the necessity of building up herd immunity, that would mean removing the social distancing measures which had a disastrous impact on the economy, the solution of an increased control over the free movement of people was the talk of the town in the form of immunity passports. A world of hypochondriacs had emerged from the crisis that had left the world, and especially the West, in awe before the incapacity of both the old and the new world imperial centers to deal with the plague of COVID-19. Even Vietnam, arguably the first victor against the neo-European established order in Asia, was faring better than the American empire. In mid-April, it announced that there were no longer any deaths from the novel coronavirus in the country. The US had been too arrogant, thinking that they could have their cake and eat it too. The higher echelons of imperial government had been warned time and time again that they were not ready to face a pandemic. But trust in Washington was put in God, not science. Perhaps the time had come for America to change by returning back to some of its great founding ideas, namely that of a confederation of many states, united as a single entity in the face of danger. Announcements were made for a new federalism in America that failed to provide its citizens with a world-class health system. Blaming China was easy, and that's what the administration was doing, hence revealing the fundamental weakness of the West's arrogance. This fundamental civilizational original sin was keeping the US from collaborating with China, which could have saved many lives. The East, not limited to China, was showing a truly Confucian stance in the face of the crisis. Serenity in the East was contrasted with hysteria, panic, and fear in the West. One notable exception seemed to be the designated culprit of the Second World War, Germany, which showed that some in the West could indeed handle the pandemic, in a meticulous and orderly manner. While the superpower who had erected the New World Order out of the chaos of the Second World War seemed to be at the edge of imploding. It took an invisible tiny enemy to overthrow Western arrogance and end the world economy that it had created. What would follow could be a more China-centric globalization. The economic fight against the pandemic had thrusted Asia to the forefront of the global policy response, and this had enormous effects on central banking around the world. Perhaps there could be no such thing as a good liberal hegemony. It seems that the US had acted too overzealously to impose its own form of liberalism around the world. The risk was that the rest could throw the baby with the bathwater, as democracies were baffled by the way in which they could integrate higher surveillance with basic civil rights during the great battle of the 21st century between democracy and dictatorship. Few outside the US were debating the reality of a decadent empire, as political thinkers were suggesting the end of grand strategy for the neo-European empire, urging Washington to think smaller, concentrating more on the looming threat of a national breakup rather than great imperial visions. Well, friends, this is it. And if you like the video, be sure to leave a thumbs up and state your historical emergencies in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.